Hello and welcome to part 2 of 6/7. And I say that because it's part 2 of 6 of the prepared supplies, prepared slides, blah, blah, blah. And part 7 because there'll be a 7th one added on, rather like there is going to be to last week's long patrol of me answering questions in the comments below them that are to do with the topic of the videos. So, once again, we are trying like this. We currently have a very nice, very nice painting, which those of you who are eagle-eyed and who watch Dracula film will know where I got that painting and who gave me that painting. So, right, I've run out of iron brew in my glass. Before I get started, I'm going to fill it up. I hope you're enjoying these videos. I'm enjoying them greatly. Hints out doing them, getting this one re-recorded because it got a bit funny when it's about midnight. Luckily, my office is outside in the garden. I can't disturb anyone by chatting away to you. So, without much further ado, it's time for the Royal Navy's strategic role in 1980s NATO. And this is the 1980 debate about the Royal Navy continued. This time we're focusing not on Sir Mr. Duffy's responses, but on Mr. Keith Speedwell's responses. Now, my copy of his book has yet to arrive. Otherwise it would be here. However, he's an interesting MP. He has quite a successful career. He's 68 to 97, so he serves 29 years in the House of Commons. He has a passion for the Royal Navy. He's unfortunately died, born in 1934, so missed out on World War II, but did serve the Royal Navy and was an avid spotter of Royal Navy stuff. And just as professional in many ways as Duffy is. However, here is where his distinction comes in, particularly for me. He resigns from supporting the Not review. Basically, he says, this is a terrible review. This review lets down all our allies. It goes against all our prior decisions, and not for any good reason other than focusing on the Central Front. Now, as I said before in part 1, when you're talking about why is Britain focusing on the Central Front, why do they focus on having the British Army of the Rhine? Why do they want these things? Why do the various successive governments support this? It's not because necessarily it's great for Britain to have a large army, or anyone in Britain really wants to have a large army. It's not traditionally what we do for a very good reason. We have, since the English Civil War, the Civil War of the Four Kingdoms, especially as it's sometimes colloquially known the English Civil War, but really was the British Civil War, considering the Scots, Irish, and Welsh all got as well involved as anyone, and the Cornish especially had a lot of fun. Britain hasn't really liked standing armies. And yes, there are often talks about, the British Army is now the smallest it's ever been, da 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 da. And I'm honestly not keen on shrinking the army, possibly as much as they are doing. But there again, I would structure the army differently, and that's a topic of a completely different discussion. What they're doing by focusing on a central front is they're focusing on the area which all their allies are focusing in on, so that they can be important in the most important area to their allies, so they can save money elsewhere. So basically, they're going to go, we're getting rid of this, and all these capabilities because they're not necessary to do these functions, but those functions anyway are secondary functions, and therefore it doesn't matter if we aren't quite able to do them. What matters is we're on the primary function, right? We're on the primary function. What's really interesting is they're basically focusing in on what I would call the 45-minute or 4-day war. Just at the moment, when the Soviet Union, when a lot of NATO thinking is now coming out of that period. My girlfriend reminded me, of course, her PhD, she's recently completed, is on the Falklands War and on Margaret Thatcher, on the press and media around the time, the politics and all those things going on. And remind me of a quote from Margaret Thatcher where she said that not was either gold or dross. The trouble was figuring out which one of the two it was. And the thing was, he was selling gold because it was a way to reduce money. But it was strategic dross. It was financial and political gold, but strategic dross. Keith Speed saw that. He pointed it out. He's a loyal minister. He's a loyal member of Parliament. Loyal to the country first, but also to the party. For someone like Speed to quit is a colossal thing. I mean, to explain it, it'd be like I don't know, asking me to desert my fluffy research assistants. It wouldn't happen. The only reason I would do that is because if I honestly thought if I thought it was better for them, for some reason, I don't know, someone hunting me and might shoot them instead of me. I don't know, sort of what, something like that. It's an absolutely devastating thing for him to have to do. It's a massive emotional wrench, and he does it because country comes first. He's a good minister. The best ministers will be loyal in public, but in private will give you their honest opinions to them, to their prime ministers, without currying for gift or favour. So here we go. The Under Secretary of State for Defence for the Royal Navy, Mr. Keith Speed, and this was in the days when you had ministers for specific services rather than ministers for abstract things which spread across different services and different this and different that, and basically they can pretend they're not responsible for anything if they want to. I should like to thank the Honourable Member for Sheffield, Attercliffe, Mr. Duffy. for the way in which he has approached the debate. I agree with many of the points that he made. However, a man from Mars listening to his speech would never realise that his party voted for cuts in defence expenditure during the last few weeks and entered the last general election calling for cuts in defence expenditure. But he, as Minister responsible for the Navy, worked hard for the Royal Navy. His heart was always in the right place. He set a very high standard in the office that I now occupy. A standard that I have tried to follow. This is the first debate on the Royal Navy in which I have taken part as Minister responsible for the Royal Navy. The Honourable Gentleman asked a series of questions, some of which will be answered in this speech. I shall try to answer others in my reply. I start by looking at the framework within which the Royal Navy of the 1980s operates. A framework securely based upon NATO. The North Atlantic Alliance is a maritime by name, and it is highly dependent upon its maritime strategies. The foundation of NATO's political and military strength is the United States' commitment to the defence of Europe. Crucial to the credibility of this commitment is the ability of NATO to keep open the lines of communication from North America in times of tension of war. Were the Warsaw Pact maritime forces ever to be allowed to dominate these lines of communications, the alliance would be in serious jeopardy. Under Admiral of the Fleet of the Soviet Union, Sergei Gorshkov, over the last quarter century, the Soviet Union has built up its navy from a predominantly coastal defence force to a modern, powerful blue water fleet capable of projecting sea power throughout the world. The Soviets are able to threaten alliance interests in the North Atlantic in times of tension or war. Their maritime power also constitutes an important instrument in the projection worldwide of Soviet foreign policy. To quote the words of Admiral Gorshkov, among the many factors characterizing the economic and military might of our country, an ever greater role is being played by its sea power, which expresses the real capability of the state to effectively utilize the world ocean in interests of building communism. The 1980 Defense White Paper dramatically illustrated the expansion of Soviet naval deployments worldwide over the 10-year period 1968 to 78. In the same period, the size of the United States Navy declined. More recently, the invasion of Afghanistan has brought home to us in the West, in the most telling way, the extent to which the Soviet Union is willing to use military force to achieve its objectives. It is a grave act of aggression, which rightly met with worldwide condemnation. It also met spirited local resistance, and Moscow now faces the prospect of a long guerrilla war of attrition against those who refuse to accept Soviet presence and domination of their country. The consequences of the Soviet invasion have been and will continue to be serious for the West. As the Secretary of State has said, it has opened the eyes of many people to the true character of the global nature of the threat. It has forced us to re-examine our ideas of defence in the NATO region and to consider seriously the scope and need for defence cooperation outside the alliance's boundaries. I am convinced that one of the themes that will dominate defence thinking over the next few years will be how best to harness the cooperation and coordination of effort towards meeting the threat as we now perceive it. Well, that's a fun piece of speaking. It's talking about the 1980 Defence White Paper, which of course precedes, not review, which comes to dramatically different conclusions. It talks about NATO being a maritime alliance. This is something which is often again forgotten, but it's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, not the European Treaty Organization or the American Treaty Organization or the We Hate the Warsaw Pact, which didn't even exist till after we'd been formed organization, officially. Unofficially, it was there beforehand, but you know, Warsaw Pact forms up rather quickly for it to have been magically not around. So, yeah, you have a very different world being talked about. But also, it's a rather similar world to us if you think about it. We probably forget, at the moment, but let's see. America, leading Western powers, navies declining. Major authoritarian, we're going to say communist, but let's be honest, neither one was true communist. And I do not say that in such a way as to say I would support a true communism ever being tried anywhere, because I don't think communism will work, but that's me. That's my personal perspective, because I think the trouble with it is its basic human nature. And the fact that you inevitably have people involved who are trying to manage it and run things for you and ensure everything's organized and live off other people's work. Whatever you do, you always end up with it. So, no. Also, think of this. He gets in a quib about Man from Mars, but he draws a difference between the party and the person. He's able to say how good a job his predecessor did. Think about that. Imagine a world where politicians and leaders of countries can be secure enough in their roles, confident enough in their duties, that they are able to say that their predecessor, who was from another political party, did a good job. Not only do that, but in the first 3 paragraphs of the speech, do that and quote a major communist leader verbatim. It's heady to think of it. It's just amazing. And such good language as well. And it's also getting into the fact that there's been a Soviet invasion and the threat has been ramping up. The threat is changing. It's sort of saying, well, we had allowed ourselves to be lulled into a full sense of security because we believed that the world was going to be peaceful. And now we've realized that it's definitely not. So now we have to deal with this. And that's not good. We didn't want to have to deal with this. We really didn't. Here we go. Questions coming in. Mr. Tarn Daliel, West Lothian. Before the minister leaves the question of Soviet armaments, what can he say, if anything, about the so-called Typhoon, the probable Soviet equivalent of Trident? It's the second strike submarine. If the honourable member cannot answer immediately, perhaps he will say something later about it in the winding up speech. Mr. Speed, I shall try to deal with that specifically in the winding up speech, when I shall deal with a number of aspects of Soviet weapons. At present, I am trying to deal with the more strategic issues. The House will recall that in response to the tense situation in the Middle East earlier this year, the Americans withdrew the carrier Nimitz and her escorting ships from the Mediterranean and redeployed them to the Arabian Sea. Since then, they have maintained a considerable maritime presence in the area, a telling example of the inherent flexibility of sea power. For the longer term, the concept of the surge force is proceeding apace, and the Americans are actively engaging
in seeking the necessary local facilities to support the increased deployment levels currently in the area and to facilitate the rapid projection of forces in an emergency. The gain in the United States naval presence in the Southwest Asia clearly has implications on the availability of Southwest of the United States forces in the NATO area. As I quote from the communique of its meeting in joint ministerial session in May, ministers agreed on the need for ensuring that at the same time as the United States carries out the efforts to strengthen defense capabilities for Southwest Asia, Allied capabilities to deter aggression and to defend NATO Europe are also maintained and strengthened. In consequence, the alliance also agreed on a number of near-term defense measures designed to improve force capabilities in the NATO area. These measures derive mainly from existing national plans with a particular impact on readiness. In addition, the alliance called for a report to be considered by ministers at their next meeting in December on further specific measures to be taken in the longer term. This report will take account of developments in the general international situation, and particularly of events in Southwest Asia. It will also look at the possible implications of the diversion of United States reinforcement forces, which are currently available for the defense of NATO area, to possible commitments in Southwest Asia. We, for our part, are determined to play our full part in responding to this challenge to the best of our ability. First and foremost, we remain wholeheartedly committed to the alliance. At the same time, we need to consider the best use which can be made of our long experience of worldwide naval operations. The main maritime threat to the alliance in the Atlantic comes from the Soviet Northern Fleet base on the Kola Peninsula, particularly its powerful nuclear-powered submarine force, and maritime power is essential to the success of Allied strategy of deterrence. It is to counter this threat that the Royal Navy of today is primarily orientated towards anti-submarine warfare. This said, it also retains a significant anti-ship and anti-aircraft capability to respond to the threat posed by large numbers of ships and aircraft in the Soviet Northern Fleet. NATO's strategic capability is based largely on submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and our contribution consists of the 4 Polaris submarines. This, we believe, is a key element in ensuring deterrence. All our major ships, about 70 in all, and the whole of our conventionally armed submarine force of more than 25 nuclear and diesel-powered boats are assigned to NATO. We also contribute to the Standing Naval Force Atlantic and Standing Naval Force Channel, 2 multinational forces which demonstrate in a very practical way the cooperation between the navies of the alliance. Their role includes the need to be able to deal with the submarine threat and to keep the Atlantic and Channel sea lanes open for reinforcement and supplies. Thus, we have a major role to play. Geographically, we are well placed to do so, and historically, we have a long seafaring tradition on which to rely. I do love it when politicians start beating the patriotism drum. It usually says they're missing something. In this case, Mr. Speed is not missing something, but he's actually actively having to work out the strategy on the fly. He has got an anti-submarine warfare force. They have got a significant amount of threats. And he is talking about a changing situation. What's interesting here is he is concentrating on the strategy first, not the weapons. If you consider modern defense debate, we tend to focus on individual weapon systems and capabilities and talk about carrier-killing ballistic missiles or the F-21 or this or that. Very, very specific system and how it's going to have a big impact. Mr. Speed and Mr. Duffy have both focused on strategy first. I.e., weapon systems are only as good as the strategy that's wielding them. So strategy you have to deal with first. And I'm often told that naval warfare and strategy is procurement strategy. It is and it isn't. It is in that largely, especially unless it's a very long war, what you start the war with, less what gets sunk, is what you will finish the war with. Falklands War, 1982, a couple of years after this. It's a long war by current standards of a long war. It's measured in weeks. It's not a war of choice, and yet what the Royal Navy had available at the end was what the Royal Navy at the start of the war with, minus what was damaged by the South Atlantic, wear and tear by one of the most vicious oceans in the world, and losses and damage caused by Argentinian aircraft. In other words, there had been significant attrition of some major assets. Let's think about that. Significant attrition of major assets. And yet, at this point, in 1980, the Royal Navy is listed as having 70 major ships and 25 nuclear and diesel-powered submarines, all the conventionally armed submarines they have available. 70 warships. Not 70 ships in total, including all the Royal Fleet Auxiliary and all the submarines. 70 warships and 25 nuclear and diesel-powered submarines. Yes, some of them are really not that capable and should have been replaced. I am not going to stand up and say that all 70 of those were amazing assets, even for 1980. After all, I think there's some Whitby class going along there, let alone some tribal class frigates and Leanders that have been interestingly modified. But today, the Navy is 19 and 7. So submarines have dropped to almost, slightly over a quarter. And surface ships to add on Albion, Bulwark, Queen Elizabeth, and Prince of Wales, you end up with 23 from 70, so roughly a third. Next slide. Mr. David Crouch, Canterbury. My honourable friend has mentioned our worldwide experience in naval matters. He has also mentioned the fact that there has been a deployment of the United States naval forces to Southwest Asian waters. Does he believe that there would be any advantage in our worldwide experience being used in some deployment of our own naval forces to Southwest Asian waters to supplement experience in the United States Navy there as well? Mr. Speed, if my honourable friend will bear with me for a while, I shall deal with that point. In a nutshell, the answer is yes, but not on a permanent basis. I shall have something to say about such a deployment in a moment. Dr. Alan Glynn, Windsor and Maidenhead. My honourable friend said, quite rightly, that our forces are based in NATO. But will he confirm at the same time that the Polaris submarine is under our personal control in this country? Obviously, that its role is with NATO, but is it not a fact that we still control the ultimate deterrent? Mr. Speed, that is so, but the commitment of our Polaris force is primarily in the first instance to NATO. Mr. Douglas J., Battersea North. Will the Minister clear up one other point about the number of Soviet submarines in existence? The Secretary of State sent me a letter after the defence debate in which he said that, counting both nuclear and non-nuclear submarines, but excluding reserves, the Soviets had about 350 submarines. That would be more than 4 times the total that Germany had at any time in either of the two World War II wars. Is that the effective total of submarines today? Mr. Speed, I confirm that is correct. We also make a significant contribution to NATO's maritime effort on the southern flank. Although here the responsibility lies primarily with the littoral states of the alliance, this year our deployments in the Mediterranean will be about 20% higher than last year in order to maintain the alliance presence in this sea, including deployment to the area of a group of ships earlier this year following the Nimitz and her group's departure. At present, for example, the frigates HMS Brighton and Dido and the ASW carrier HMS Bulwark are in the Mediterranean. Other ships in the area of the Straits of Gibraltar the past few days include the assault ship HMS Intrepid and a group of 3 frigates and 3 submarines on an exercise. Outside the NATO area, it is, as my honourable friend, the Memory for Canterbury, Mr. Couch, suggested, incumbent on us to use our particular capabilities and experience as flexibly as possible to respond to the global threat. Diplomatic and economic means are, of course, open to us and used to foster our interests. Military resources, too, can be brought to bear in several ways, and the Royal Navy will play its full part. For example, we provide personal loan to friendly states to help them build up their defensive capability. Training courses are also provided in naval establishments in the United Kingdom. The Royal Navy is particularly well equipped to carry out temporary deployments, which can provide a practical means of demonstrating our continued capability and interest outside the immediate area for which we have responsibility under NATO as I speak. A task group of destroyers, frigates, and a float support is about to enter the Indian Ocean. Later in its deployment, it will visit China. That represents the first visit in 30 years by the Royal Navy, and is a sign of the increasingly cordial relations between our countries. The group will not return to the United Kingdom until the end of this year. We also frequently deploy ships to the Caribbean, particularly in order to discharge our responsibilities to our remaining commitments there, and partly to demonstrate that we share the general concern of many of our allies to maintain stability in the area. Today, for example, HMS Eskimo is on passage back from our tour of duty as Belize guard ship and has been relieved by HMS Glasgow. Elsewhere, too, in places as far as by the Falkland Islands and Hong Kong, the Royal Navy and Royal Marines continue to undertake tasks in support of national commitments and contribute to the capability we can bring to bear to meet ad hoc requirements around the world. So, what are we learning? Well, we're learning that Britain's deploying a force to China to say hello. They're quite a significant task group. That they're also deploying a task group to the Mediterranean to cover for the Americans moving Nimitz. And they have significant capability in 1980. That includes HMS Bulwark, which is listed as an ASW carrier. I wonder if she'd still been around in 1982, whether she could have been extra Harriers if we'd had them. We can dream. Anyway. And the traditional question about control of the ballistic missile submarines comes up. That always comes up. There is always a significant perception. And one of the ones I was used to was, yes, but the Americans control GPS. For some reason, I can't think why, GPS is not used in the targeting of Trident or Polaris. Might be because there's a theory that those particular satellites will be targeted by anyone in a major war as a way to try and cripple the Western Alliance's systems, and therefore you can't afford to use them. So they tend to use very accurate star charts. Very, very accurate star charts, from all I've been told. Which does, of course, perspective has a particular perspective, because can you start to muck around with stars? And you make enough bright lights go up there to perhaps confuse ballistic missiles? It's an idea. I think if it was actually possible, someone would have done a lot of work doing it, though, now. Anyway, on to the next slide. Mr. Wilkinson, my honourable friend, has given an interesting exposition of Royal Navy deployments around the globe. As the Soviet Navy has emerged as a worldwide force, should we not re-examine the Brussels Treaty and ascertain whether our European alliance nations, particularly Germany, can assume a greater ocean-going role? At present, the treaty specifically prohibits that. Mr. Speed, the Federal Republic of Germany and other countries have been examining that aspect. For example, the Italians recently made a round-the-world deployment with considerable success. Other NATO countries are acting along those lines. I am not sure that my right honourable friend is correct to say that those nations are prohibited. My information is that there are certain provisions whereby they can deploy forces outside the NATO area. They may well wish to do so. My honourable friend is right to point out that the European NATO navies may have such a task. Mr. Daliel, Mr. Speed, I wish to get on, as other honourable members wish to speak, and there will be a winding up speech later. I spoke a moment ago of the maritime threat to the Alliance in the Atlantic, and of the forces available to meet it. The threat is increasing both quantitatively and qualitatively, and it is therefore vital that we continue to maintain the capability of our own ships, submarines, and shipborne aircraft. I therefore agree with the honourable member for Athercliffe. We plan, therefore, to press ahead energetically with re-equipping our naval forces. The Soviet nuclear-powered submarine fleet will continue to grow during the 1980s, and the primary role of our forces in the Eastern Atlantic is to combat it. One of our primary weapons in this field of warfare is our nuclear-powered hunter-killer submarine. If we can negotiate a satisfactory price with the builders, we plan to order a fourth boat of the improved Trafalgar class later this year, which on entering service would bring our SSN fleet to 16. Be still my beating heart. The command and control of anti-submarine warfare forces will be provided by the new class of anti-submarine carriers, the Invincible class ships. HMS Invincible has been accepted this year, and I was very impressed when I visited her a few weeks ago. Illustrious and Ark Royal are under construction. The first two ships of the new Type 22 class of anti-submarine warfare frigate, Broadsword and Battleaxe, have also been accepted this year, and a further 4 are on order. Carrying Lynx helicopters and improved detection equipment, those vessels will make a major addition to our anti-submarine warfare capability, and further orders are planned. There will be a number of improvements in ASW weapons. It is intended that a new submarine-launched heavyweight torpedo went into service by 1990 to replace the current Mark 24 Tigerfish. Both a new British development and a further development of the United States Mark 48 torpedo are now the subject of bid design competition. This phase is due to end in January 1981, and a choice between the options will then be made. The new lightweight torpedo, Stingray, designed to be launched from the surface ships, helicopter and maritime patrol aircraft, will, when it enters service in the mid-1980s, be by far the most advanced weapon of its kind in the Alliance, if not the world. Progressively replace the Mark 44 and the Mark 46 torpedoes currently in service with the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force. Some 4,500 people are expected to be employed in Stingray production. It is a costly project, but I must ask whether, in the face of the growing threat, it makes sense to make a massive investment in anti-submarine warfare ships an aircraft unless we have the weapon with which to make a certain of killing the submarine. Only Stingray will fulfill that requirement. Again, I would point out this is a very novel statement. It's basically saying, why are we investing in... We cannot justify investing in ships if we don't have mature, capable weapon systems to equip them with that are up to the task. I am, of course, not in any way thinking about Harpoon, the Type 45 Daring class being fitted for not with Mark 41 BLS. I am not going to think about any of those things which have become common, or the fact that even actually under Mr. Speed, and when he was making the case for it, as I'm sure you're unsurprised, and Mr. Attercliffe has said, Mr. Duffy of Attercliffe has already said it, close-in weapon systems on frigates and destroyers of the 1980s force. Yes. Now, quick summary of this one. It's a fun discussion talking about the 1980 defense debate, and it does set up the 1980s rather well. And actually, the 1980s feeds into a whole series of books. Yes. Now, I have a few of these. Forces 87 books, or Forces 86 and Forces 88 to go through, and I will be pointing out where stuff is relevant. But one of the interesting things you get when you sort of consider a book like that, and its discussion of the various forces that were available in the 1980s, is that you realize very quickly that you have to be strategic. The odds of you being able to select, if war happens, where you're going to fight, when you're going to fight, is very low. And this is for both sides. Because both sides are making calculations based on their perception of what their opponent will do, of what their opponent will act. Currently, we've got a classic example going on as we speak on the Indian-Chinese border, where the sides are selecting to use sticks and stones, batons and clubs, rather than projectile weapons, because both sides think as long as they keep it within those realms, and maybe knives, it won't escalate between two nuclear powers. It won't escalate as long as we use the weapons which were often argued, I know not, we all remember the quote, I know not what weapons World War III will be fought with, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. Well, that's already happening. But it gets more complicated when you start to think of the games that might be being played underwater or on the water. We have seen ships being harassed by trawlers and technically civilian vessels many times over the last couple of decades. And who knows what the underwater stuff is happening. We can also see the response. The response is more and more to focus on technology over people. And that's one of the interesting things about this defence debate. It's one of the last times in British defence debate where the automatic solution being sought out isn't technology. as we speak, currently, Britain is investing in a very capable, very large, unmanned, uncrewed undersea vessel. Not full submarine size, but over 100 feet in length, so longer than the American equivalent, which is going to have a multi-mission payload bay that can be outfitted with weapons or different this or that, whatever it needs to do, and all these things. Apparently, a range of 3,000 nautical miles. And there are various assumptions about whether it's going to be diesel electric or similar. To get that would suggest it is going to be, because if you're doing that on batteries and it's uncrewed, you're being pretty brave. But why is Britain doing that? Because it knows it's not got enough SSNs, and it can't ramp up production of SSNs without interrupting the Dreadnought program, which is the next generation of ballistic missile submarines. And the fear is that Britain can't build SSKs, that it doesn't have the capabilities to. Now, that's the publicly sort of, how do I put it, not stated, but publicly rumoured fear. Here's the actual probable reason. Setting up and putting into water SSKs would be expensive. Even more expensive than these uncrewed vessels. The hope is that they will work, that they'll be cheaper, they'll require less people, and it won't require as larger and or as complicated a training program to set up, or one of the very specific yards which can actually build vessels of this size, or vessels of the SSK size. But it's also done with the knowledge, and this is the other secret trick that's there with when governments rely on technology, is one of two things will happen. Either the threat will go away, or by the time it materializes and you realize you should have built some SSKs, it will be another government in charge. It'll be someone else's problem. You won't have this debate like this we're talking about in this 1980s debate, where you have a former Navy minister, now a member of the NATO Assembly, doing all those sort of things, debating with the current Navy minister and for the good of the nation. That won't happen. They'll be off. And let's be honest, if you were being sensible, you'd be ordering some SSKs and you'd be ordering these vessels. Because those uncrewed vessels, they represent the quickest ability to ramp up numbers and capability, undersea capabilities. Although they will probably need a mothership, a Bay class type vessel with a dock to support them, or an Albion and Bulwarks type vessel. Probably Bay class, it's cheaper, so government's more likely to buy it. But that is the way which a government which was prioritizing, I would say, national industry and national security would go. Because you'd be sure your SSKs would work, and you could build 4 of them. And they would cover the gap while you developed up these uncrewed vessels. So what would probably been proposed in the 1970s if they'd had this technology. It's what might have been proposed in the 1950s. It's what would have been done in the 1930s. But it isn't what will be done today. I don't know, unless someone watches this video and decides to learn history. Anyway, thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. There's going to be the next section of Mr. Speed's speech will be done in part 3, and I hope you stay to enjoy that. So thank you very much for watching. Take care, and if you like, please like. If you're interested, please in seeing more, please subscribe. Maybe check out Discord below, or there's the little bell down there, or Patreon, as I said in other videos. If you would like to support my very expensive book habit, it's always welcome. Thank you very much, and take care.